Energy Delta Institute.
Good afternoon and welcome back at EDI TV. Our next guest is Mr. Jean Vermeire, who is the president of the International Group of LNG Importers. Furthermore, Mr. Vermeire is a senior fellow and a key lecturer at the LNG Masterclass of the Energy Delta Institute. Mr. Vermeire, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for the invitation.
You're a prominent expert on LNG. May I ask you right away, what will be the role of LNG here in Europe for the future?
Well, the role of LNG over time certainly has grown, and it has also changed. A few years back, LNG was a relatively small part of the portfolio, less than 10%. And at that time, LNG was basically a means to diversify the supplies. Nowadays, LNG is about 12–13% of the portfolio, and we expect that by 2020, LNG as a share of the portfolio could double, reach up to 25. So the role has grown, has changed. It remains a means of diversification, but of course it has become a competitive supply source which Europe needs because of its growing demand and also because of the decline of indigenous production. So in that sense, LNG is bound to play a very important role in our energy supplies, in our gas supplies.
And is Europe enough competitive to lay its hands on sufficient LNG supplies?
That's a very good question, and of course it is a big issue right now because we of course are all aware that there are quite a few discussions on price, and nowadays of course it's a message that a lot of producers like to send, in the sense that they tend to state that Europe might not be competitive, might lose out. I would of course leave aside a little bit the more commercial messages that are being sent across the media nowadays and look at fundamentals. Europe is a very important market. The suppliers of LNG would certainly need that market. And of course, when and if Europe needs new supplies, then I'm certain that the price discussions will be resolved. One important factor for Europe that helps Europe in the global competition is that, of course, one important competitor, you could say, has dropped out of the race, which is the US. So the competition for new LNG supplies has become what you could call a two-horse race, Asia and Europe. Asia, of course, doesn't have a choice, or not much of a choice yet. Asia is dependent on LNG for its supplies. Europe still has a choice between LNG and pipeline gas. And I'm pretty certain, as I said, that perhaps in a few years the price discussions will be resolved. The differences between spot prices and more traditional long-term contract prices will have closed, and Europe will be very active again in the market, and the LNG suppliers will pay lots of attention to Europe as being an important demand for their product.
And who do you think would those LNG suppliers be? Who would bring LNG to Europe?
Well, the transportation cost is of course an important factor, and the new projects would of course in first instance look for what I would call what one calls in the industry foundation customers, meaning customers that contract on a long-term basis and can actually absorb the full cost So new suppliers would look to such customers, and the logical sources and the logical destination would be Europe for sources like Africa and the Middle East. So long-term contracts, new contracts, are more likely to come with those suppliers, but that does not preclude that on a short-term basis, flexible trading, spot trading, that of course you could also have cargoes from other parts of the world. Now, in light of the recent events, it's perhaps a bit less likely that in the near term a lot of spot or flexible cargoes would move from the Pacific to the Atlantic. But of course, you still could have LNG spot short-term trade from the Caribbean, and perhaps even in a couple of years' time from the Gulf of Mexico, as the US is preparing a number of export projects for which, on a short-term, occasional basis, Europe could be a market.
We've been talking about energy transition here at the studio and the place of gas in the future energy mix. One of the arguments given is that gas is very flexible and can be a good backup for renewables. Do you see any role in that regard for LNG storage?
Well, you're certainly right that renewables, and in particular wind and solar, given the intermittency of the production, that they need backup. And the backup they need, there are not that many other plants that can provide it. Perhaps hydro could provide it, provided of course you have in the country sufficient rainfall and snowfall that you can rely on it. So gas indeed is a very logical backup. Whether now LNG would be the right flexible source of gas feed is of course another question. If you have at any time or at all times sufficient LNG in your tankage, then of course LNG could provide that. But in order to be able to provide that flexible, reliable backup for the to cope with the intermittency of renewables, you need ample availability, and of course you need also ample tankage. Particularly in Europe, our terminals are not built for that purpose. We don't usually have that much backup. Storing LNG on a volume basis is rather expensive. And of course, one has to assume that the current fairly ample surplus situation in LNG might change. So, although at times LNG could provide that, play that role, to me it's of course more logical and more economic to then use a kind of storage, buffer storage, an underground storage, and in particularly cavern storage. To use the LNG as a backup, in my view, is probably not going to work at all times. The more economic choice is elsewhere, but it's still gas. It might not be LNG, but it's still gas. And the supply source might still be LNG, but you would actually use the flexibility from a gas underground storage and not from the LNG storage.
You've mentioned a couple of times the flexibility of gas and the possibility to use it as backup to renewables. Do you see it only as a backup or also as base load for the future?
And you refer now to power generation. The situation in the countries, of course, differs. In some countries where you have nuclear, where you have a lot of cogeneration, logically the role for gas as baseload will be a lesser one. In other countries where you don't have nuclear, you might not have that much cogeneration. There, gas can be used as baseload. The advantage, the intrinsic advantage, of course, of gas is that it can play many roles. It can play the role as baseload. It can also play the role as midload, because combined cycles are very flexible, can be more easily turned up or down than other power stations. Gas certainly is more than a transition. It's perhaps more a destination than a transition. And as we said, it can also play a very valuable role as backup. And you could almost say that without gas, renewables will have it very difficult to become an important role in any portfolio. As soon as renewables reaches a certain weight share in a portfolio, they are very much dependent on the backup, and that backup will be gas.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. We enjoyed having you here. Thank you for coming and being our guest. Thank you for following our interviews, and stay with us. Our next guest is coming.
Energy Delta Institute.
Fresh.